In 1795, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant published a bold and visionary essay titled Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. It was a time of immense upheaval in Europe. The French Revolution had shaken monarchies to their core, and the continent remained engulfed in religious conflict, imperial rivalry, and seemingly endless warfare. Kant, a thinker deeply committed to reason and moral philosophy, asked a radical question: could humanity design a world without war? Not through utopian dreams, but through rational principles and political structure? In Perpetual Peace, he sets out a practical roadmap, one that rejects the cycles of violence driven by conquest, pride, and unchecked power. Instead, he offers a framework rooted in law, mutual respect, and republican governance, a vision where peace is not merely the absence of war, but the result of conscious design. This was no naive idealism. Kant had witnessed the horrors of war and the dangers of despotism. His proposal was intended as a philosophical counterpoint to the violent realpolitik of his age. And more than 2 centuries later, it continues to influence debates on international relations, democracy, and global cooperation. Kant opens Perpetual Peace with 6 preliminary articles, concrete steps that states must take immediately to prevent the outbreak of future wars. These are not yet the foundation of a peaceful world, but necessary preconditions to make lasting peace even possible. First, no peace treaty shall be considered valid if it was made with a secret reservation of material for a future war. Kant insists that peace must be sincere and transparent. Secret clauses or hidden agendas undermine trust between nations. If a peace deal simply delays the next war, it isn't true peace, it's a tactical pause. Openness, he argues, is essential to mutual confidence. Second, no independent state shall be acquired by another by inheritance, exchange, purchase, or donation. Here, Kant rejects the idea that nations can be treated like property. In his time, it was common for rulers to trade or claim territories through marriage, diplomacy, or conquest. But for Kant, people are not pawns. Every political community has the right to determine its own fate, regardless of the interests of powerful rulers. Third, standing armies shall be gradually abolished. Kant doesn't advocate for immediate demilitarization, but he sees standing armies as inherently threatening. Maintaining a permanent military force fuels suspicion among neighbors and drains resources better spent on civil society. More dangerously, it prepares states for war as a normal condition. Security, he argues, should not come from arms races, but from trust and cooperation. Fourth, national debts shall not be contracted with a view to the external friction of states. Kant warns against the dangerous coupling of public debt and war. When governments borrow money specifically to finance conflict, they pass the burden of destruction to future citizens, often long after the political aims of the war are forgotten. He calls for financial responsibility and opposes mortgaging peace for short-term aggression. Fifth, no state shall forcibly interfere in the constitution and government of another state. This is a clear rejection of interventionism. Even if a regime seems unjust or undemocratic, Kant argues, no external power has the right to impose change by force. Intervening in another country's politics not only disrespects its sovereignty, but risks endless cycles of revenge and instability. Sixth, no state shall, during war, permit such acts of hostility which would make mutual trust impossible in a future peace. This includes assassination, poisoning, incitement to treason, and the like. Even in war, Kant believes there must be rules, restraints that preserve the possibility of reconciliation. Without basic moral limits, peace becomes unthinkable after the fighting ends. Taken together, these 6 articles form Kant's first firewall against conflict. They are not lofty aspirations, they are actionable principles to stop the bleeding of perpetual war. For Kant, only after these conditions are met can states begin to build a more just and lasting international order. In Perpetual Peace, Kant doesn't stop at halting war. He sets out the foundations for building a world where peace becomes structurally inevitable. His 3 definitive articles lay out what must be true within and between states for peace to endure. Republican constitutions, a federation of free states, and universal hospitality. First, Kant calls for republican constitutions within each state. Now, by republican, he doesn't mean direct democracy. He means a political system where power is divided, where elected legislatures make the laws and a separate executive enforces them. In such a system, rulers can't unilaterally declare war for personal ambition or pride. Why is this so crucial? Because when citizens, the very people who pay for war with their lives and livelihoods, have a say, war becomes a last resort, not a tool of politics. A government that truly represents its people will be much more cautious about engaging in conflict. For Kant, this internal restraint is the first step toward real peace. Second, he proposes a federation of free states. This is not a global government, but a voluntary league, an alliance of sovereign nations committed to non-aggression and peaceful cooperation. They agree to settle disputes through reason and dialogue, not through force. This federation provides a basic legal structure and international rule of law that helps prevent the chaos of unregulated power struggles between states. The goal is simple but profound: to create a global order where war is no longer the default tool of diplomacy. Third, Kant introduces the concept of universal hospitality, or what he calls the cosmopolitan right. This means that when a foreigner arrives peacefully on your soil, you must treat them with respect, not as an enemy, but as a fellow human being. This right doesn't mean full citizenship or residency, but it does mean protection, dignity, and the possibility of peaceful interaction. Kant believed that this kind of openness fosters trust and understanding between cultures. When strangers are treated as guests instead of threats, it becomes harder for fear and hatred to take root. And from this mutual respect, a foundation for lasting peace can grow. These three principles, republican constitutions, a federation of peaceful states, and universal hospitality, aren't just isolated ideals. They reinforce each other. Republics are more cautious about war. Federations reduce the likelihood of conflict. Hospitality builds trust between peoples. Kant believed that with these structures in place, humanity could escape the endless cycles of conquest, revenge, and destruction. Peace would no longer be a fragile ceasefire. It would be a lasting achievement, rooted in law, justice, and the shared dignity of all people. This, for Kant, is not a utopian dream, but a rational, achievable design for a better world. Kant's vision of peace doesn't just rest on treaties or diplomacy. It depends on how states govern themselves. In Perpetual Peace, he draws a sharp distinction between forms of government, placing his trust in republicanism, not democracy, at least not in the way we often use the word today. To Kant, a republic is a system where the executive and legislative powers are separate. The laws are made by representatives of the people, and the authority to enforce those laws rests with a distinct branch. Crucially, in a republic, the consent of the governed is required before going to war. This structural restraint is key. Kant argues that if those who declare war must also bear its burdens, the lives lost, the taxes raised, the economic disruption, they will be far more reluctant to wage it. In contrast, in systems where rulers are unchecked, where war can be launched for glory, pride, or gain, the people often pay the price for decisions they never approved. Interestingly, Kant criticizes direct democracy not because it gives people too much voice, but because it can give rise to mob rule, where emotion overrides law and stability. He saw republicanism not as less democratic, but as more stable, precisely because it embeds deliberation and legal constraints into political decision-making. This insight anticipates what modern political science would later call the democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies, especially liberal republics, almost never go to war with one another. The reasoning is the same. Shared values, institutional checks, and public accountability make aggressive war far less likely. Kant wasn't just theorizing. He was observing a pattern. Where governments are responsive to their citizens and grounded in law, peace becomes more durable. A republican state is one where power is exercised with caution, and war is weighed not as a spectacle, but as a deadly and costly choice. In today's world, we continue to test Kant's thesis. While no system is perfect, the record shows that when freedom, law, and popular consent guide governance, conflict becomes the exception, not the rule. For Kant, The structure of a government isn't just a domestic issue, it's a moral foundation for global peace. Republics, by their very nature, contain within them a kind of peacemaking logic, one that slows the march to war, insists on public justification, and upholds the dignity of every citizen. And when many such states form a federation, rooted in law and mutual respect, peace is no longer a fragile hope. It becomes a rational, institutional reality. In the final pillar of his vision for lasting peace, Kant turns to the concept of universal hospitality, what he calls ius cosmopoliticum, or cosmopolitan right. This isn't about charity or emotional warmth. For Kant, hospitality is a legal principle, the idea that all individuals have the right to peacefully present themselves in a foreign land, not as enemies or intruders, but as fellow members of a shared humanity. He carefully distinguishes this from the right to settle or to be welcomed as a permanent guest. What he defends is the right to be received without hostility, so long as one comes in peace. In a globally interconnected world where people and goods cross borders, this basic recognition of others' dignity is essential. Why does this matter for peace? Because Kant saw that mistrust, xenophobia, and conquest often begin with the denial of even the most basic human encounter. When strangers are treated automatically as threats, violence becomes a default. But when the law protects the peaceful stranger, when it obliges us to see others not as enemies but as potential partners, war loses its justification. This idea would echo centuries later in the development of international human rights law, refugee protection, and norms of diplomatic immunity and global cooperation. In fact, many elements of Kant's cosmopolitan right are embedded in today's United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For Kant, global peace isn't just about treaties between states, it's also about how we treat people across borders. Universal hospitality is the ethical groundwork for a global legal order, one where justice isn't confined to nationality or citizenship, but extended to all human beings simply because they are human. In this way, Kant calls on us to reimagine international relations, not as a competition between powers, but as a shared moral project rooted in law, respect, and the recognition of a common destiny.